In August of 1978, Olympic Airways Flight 411 accelerated down the runway when one of its engines exploded. However, the aircraft had reached rotational speed, so there was no turning back. Without one of its engines, the plane struggled to climb quickly enough and threatened to stall. With the plane now headed toward the densely populated city of Caltha at such a low altitude, the pilot had to act fast. What he did next shocked everyone. This is the story of Olympic Airways Flight 411 and how a captain's out-of-the-box thinking saved 418 lives. It was a hot Greek summer's day on the 9th of August 1978 when 400 passengers, most of whom were Americans heading back home from vacations in Greece, were set to board the massive Boeing 747 belonging to Greece's flag carrier, Olympic Airways. The flight, scheduled as Flight 411, was set to depart in the 2 p.m. slot from Athens Ellinikon International Airport to JFK International Airport in New York. The aircraft being used was the massive Boeing 747-200 quad jet, which was common in many airlines' fleets at the time and had first been delivered to Olympic Airways in 1973. Olympic Airways acquired many 747s for its prime route, including a non-stop route between Athens and New York. This allowed large numbers of American tourists to be accommodated on single flights at lower per-seat costs to the airline. However, the jet had its fair share of troubles in the past. It housed the Pratt & Whitney JT9D turbofan engines, which were reportedly developed on an accelerated timetable and resulted in some engine flaws, thereby requiring proper maintenance to run efficiently. There had even been an incident with American Airlines where the JT9D fan blades disintegrated after one of its engines exploded just seconds after takeoff. That incident was likely due to an ongoing pattern of the JT9D engine becoming overheated during starting procedures. Regardless of these problems, the 747 remained a popular aircraft, and the 400 passengers had no issues boarding the plane. Joining them were 18 crew members, including the pilot in command, Captain C.I.S. Midas, who had 32 years of experience flying with Olympic Airways. With him was First Officer Konstantinos Fardos, a seasoned pilot and a close friend of Midas. Pre-flight checks were conducted by the crew, and the Boeing 747 was deemed fit and given clearance for takeoff. Just before 2 p.m. local time, the plane was pushed back from the gate to prepare for departure. The weather, though clear, was quite hot at 32 degrees Celsius, which potentially played a role in what was to come. Also playing a role was Athens' mountainous topography. Just after 2 p.m., the Boeing 747 began to taxi down runway 33R. The pilots noticed that the aircraft was a bit sluggish but pushed on, as this wasn't uncommon. However, just before liftoff, a loud explosion rocked the cabin. Engine number 3 had just suffered a catastrophic failure due to overheating. At this point, the aircraft had surpassed its rotational speed, so it had to continue its ascent with an exploded engine. In the cabin, one of the flight attendants received an intercom message from a colleague at the back, reporting that the inboard engine on the right-hand side of the aircraft had blown up. The colleague expressed their fears over the situation, to which the flight attendant affirmed. It was as if they knew what was to come. Controllers in the tower observed in shock as they watched Flight 411 struggle to gain altitude while its shattered engine littered the runway with parts. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, the captain was trying his best to force performance out of the plane, but there were a few problems. Engine number 2 had recently undergone maintenance and wasn't performing at optimal levels, worsening the crew's predicament. Just after liftoff, the water flow warning sounded in the flight deck. Unfortunately, the flight crew misinterpreted this warning as a water run-out warning and decided to turn off the water pump switch. Doing this with a damaged engine impacted the aircraft's ability to climb. Despite these challenges, the plane was somehow able to take off, though it struggled to gain the required airspeed and altitude. Despite needing more speed, Captain Midas decided to command an immediate retraction of the landing gear at just 35 feet of altitude. This decision was against Boeing's policies for the situation because retracting the gear at that point would mean the landing gear doors would open and then close, resulting in a temporary increase in drag. At that point, any increase in drag could have caused the plane to crash back down. However, the first officer complied with the captain, as a hill in their flight path would have been impossible to clear with the landing gear slowing the plane down. The captain was relying on his decades of experience. Once the landing gear was up, the plane gained a bit of altitude, but a 200-foot hill barely a mile away stood in the aircraft's path. The captain had no choice but to pull the nose of the aircraft up. All the airspeed that had been built up so far bled away, yet the 747 cleared the hill by just 9 feet. Climbing to avoid the hill cost the 747 precious airspeed, which was needed to keep the plane in the air. The captain was forced to drop the aircraft's nose to gain speed, trading about 50 feet of altitude for about 6 knots of airspeed, which just prevented the aircraft from stalling. At this point, the aircraft was flying only around 200 feet above Kaltha, a densely populated area of Athens. This municipality, the second most densely populated in Greece, has over 100,000 inhabitants. An air crash in such a location would have caused devastating destruction and thousands of lives to be lost. The aircraft passed close to the Athens Tower complex, the tallest building in Greece, barely clearing its television antennas. It flew so low that flight attendants observed the shocked expressions of people in nearby buildings as the jumbo jet passed by. The crew, who were barely managing to keep the aircraft airborne, now had to fly at a level altitude below 200 feet at a speed of 160 knots while being unable to turn. At that point, the captain's focus was on getting the plane away from the city and into an unpopulated area to at least reduce the potential loss of lives if the plane crashed. A translated recording from the captain revealed that he considered it was over for everyone on board. Meanwhile, in the cabin, the passengers were unaware of what was going on, and some of them reportedly thought they were on a planned sightseeing tour and started taking pictures. Regardless of what they thought, the aircraft was now headed for a collision with Mount Igalo, a few hundred feet ahead. With the situation as it was, the crew knew they couldn't overfly the mountain. Their luck changed when the flight engineer was able to successfully optimize the 3 remaining engines, giving them some more power to work with. At the same time, a southwest sea breeze began to blow, bringing up the speed of the plane, and the increasingly cooler air gave the plane a lift. The airspeed and altitude of the aircraft slowly began to creep up, but the ground beneath them was also rising. The captain knew there was no way he could clear the mountain at the current airspeed, but he did have just enough to complete a bank turn without stalling. So he turned the plane out to sea and waited as the airspeed slowly picked up. When the aircraft hit 300 feet of altitude, the captain, now feeling more confident, decided to retract the flaps a bit. The aircraft was then able to climb to just over 1,500 feet, where he began dumping fuel to bring down its weight. With the plane much lighter, it was able to climb safely and could make its way back to Ellinikon International Airport. Against all odds, Flight 411 was able to land back at the airport without a single injury. Throughout the incident, communication with air traffic control was limited, and those at the control tower were relieved to see the aircraft make it back in one piece. It was unknown to him at the time, but by saving the lives of 418 people, Captain Megidus had just averted the 3rd worst air disaster of all time. The return of the aircraft was met with wild applause on the ground. Captain Megidus exited the plane to see his 2 terrified but proud daughters waiting for him. The Greek National Air Safety Board, which investigates aviation accidents and incidents, wasn't established until 2004. However, the then Vice President of Customer Support at Boeing, Brian Weigel, issued a report. In this report, he concluded that no malfunction in the airframe or engines caused the lack of performance following takeoff. Instead, they blamed the problem on the inadvertent shutoff of the water injection pumps by the flight crew, as well as the resulting decrease in thrust. He added that the loss of wet thrust in a situation where the aircraft was takeoff climb limited severely reduced the ability to continue the flight with any significant amount of positive climb gradient. Apparently, once thrust was manually increased at a coordination time of approximately 325 seconds, the aircraft climbed out in a normal manner. Contrary to what the captain said, the report didn't mention the explosion of engine number 3, as well as the power loss of other engines. Newspapers, on the other hand, reported that engine 3 exploded during takeoff due to the overheating of the turbine cooling pipes. When investigators looked at the data from the recorders, they were quite shocked as to how Captain Megidus had managed to keep the plane in the air despite slowing down to 158 knots at one point. In fact, all Boeing simulations of the flight resulted in crashes. Following the incident, Olympic Airlines changed some of its procedures based on lessons learned from the flight. Although turning off the water pumps was blamed for the overheating and explosion of the number 3 engine, it was suggested by some that their primary purpose wasn't for cooling but rather for improved performance. However, it was hard to deny that it played no role in the incident. Nevertheless, the consequences of such an occurrence were averted thanks to one man, Captain Megidus. Because he could have stuck to Boeing's checklist and kept the landing gear extended, he didn't. Fortunately for everyone on board and below, he trusted in his experience and was able to think ahead and break the rules in a way that saved the lives of almost 500 people and potentially even thousands. The most impressive part is that he only had around 93 seconds to make his decision. Incredibly, the same flight crew still ended up flying the passengers to New York on a replacement 747 at 6 p.m. the same day. As for the affected 747, reports noted that it stayed with Olympic Airways until 1985 before joining Transworld Airlines. It was finally retired in 1997 after 24 years of service. Megidus was reportedly so proud of the feat that he kept a copy of the flight data recorder with him as proof for whenever people doubted his tremendous story. In a 1994 interview, Megidus stated, "Those of us who survived that day are stowaways in life. The story of Olympic Airways Flight 411 was a lesson about trusting one's gut in the midst of a dangerous situation." Captain Megidus could have gone Boeing's way but trusted in his ability to steer the massive aircraft through the crowd of buildings while still facing potential danger from surrounding hills. At the end of the day, Megidus triumphed against all odds, and no one could be more thankful for that than the other 417 people aboard Flight 411. What do you think about Captain Megidus's heroics? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, take care.